Okay, let's start reviewing the first lesson on the Patriarchal Dispensation or Law period. As we mentioned before, in Hebrews 1 and verse 1, God spoke to the fathers during the patriarchal period of time. The best place to start with reviewing what was spoken is going back to the beginning, the creation as first recorded in the scriptures in the book of Genesis. There are many theories about the origin of the earth and the universe. One is the theory of evolution, where all life developed from a simple cell structure from the sea and evolved into all forms of life as we know it today. Another theory advocates that the earth spun off from the sun. Another is the Big Bang theory, where there is a great cosmic explosion that started the process of evolving creation. Notice that none of these theories explain an absolute beginning, for they all begin with something already in existence. It is also very evident, when considering creation, that it has been made highly organized with great precision, supernaturally intelligent, and with imagination well beyond our comprehension. Could this really be the result of an explosion of great disarray, or some abstract happening? We don't know of any happening at any time that would logically and believably support these theories. Genesis 1:1 provides the answer about creation. It says, "In the beginning." Doesn't say when, just the beginning. When God created the heavens and the earth, God, the power that brought all things into existence. Who else other than a God could do something so marvelous and miraculous? This is how our world got here and all of its life forms. This chapter goes on to tell us in what order things were created. Genesis 1 verse 26, we're told about the creation of man in God's image and likeness. It reads, "And God said, Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth." And it was so done. There are many references to God's hands, face, back, arms, feet, and other body parts to indicate we are an image of God. Likewise, likeness may refer to God's mental and emotional qualities that we share, such as love, gentleness, tenderness, patience, long-suffering, as well as anger and jealousy, among others. Genesis 1:27 says, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, male and female created he them." In the following verses in chapter 1, God blesses them and tells them to be fruitful and multiply, have dominion over all things, create and subdue the earth, to eat the fruits of the herbs and trees yielding seeds, instructs the beasts, fowls, and creeping things to eat every green herb for meat. And God saw everything he made was good. You may wish to read along in your Bible to review these verses throughout the study. Simply press the pause button icon on your screen. When ready, press the play to resume. In Genesis 2:8, God plants a garden in Eden, and there he put man he had formed. We don't know specifically where this location is today, but the Bible references and archaeology give us some clues about the general area. Archaeologists have found in an area close to the Persian Gulf some of the oldest remains of civilization known to man. Also in Genesis 2 verses 10 through 14, it refers to a river that watered the Garden of Eden and then parted into four rivers, the Pishon, Gihon, Tigris, and Euphrates. We know the location of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, so at their common juncture may have been the Garden of Eden. The location is not significant to our understanding of the Scriptures, but it is interesting and conforms to what we may expect, because almost all Bible history took place from the Persian Gulf northward and surrounding the Mediterranean Sea. The next chart shows a map of this area and the general location of the rivers. Genesis 2:15 says that God put man in the garden to dress it and keep it. He also told man that he could freely eat of any tree in the garden except the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because if he ate or touched it, he would surely die. You probably remember the story of man, Adam and the woman Eve, being created by God from the rib of Adam, and together they were left to tend the garden. Genesis 3 tells us about Eve being tempted by the serpent, which was Satan posing as a serpent, who was more subtle than any of the beasts of the field. When Eve thought it would be good to eat the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, to be wise as God, she ate the fruit of that tree and gave some to Adam, and he ate also. As God later walked in the garden, God confronted Adam and Eve, who were hiding and being clothed. When they disclosed they were naked, God asked them how they knew. and of course was aware of their eating the fruit. For this sin, God brought a curse upon the serpent, Satan, and cast Adam and Eve out of the garden, where they would also suffer death. We might ask the question, what's so wrong with eating a piece of fruit? Or what made eating this fruit so bad? The only answer is because God said not to do it. The lesson we learn is that when God asks us to do or not do something, we should obey, or we will be punished for our disobedience, as Adam and Eve were. Before God cast Adam and Eve out of the garden, he put a curse on the serpent. According to Genesis 3 and verse 14, it says, "Cursed above all cattle and beasts of the field, and crawl on his belly and eat the dust all of his life." And he gave a promise and a curse to the woman. That promise, found in Genesis 3:14 and 15, was that God would put enmity between the serpent and the woman, and the serpent's seed and her seed. And the woman's seed would bruise the serpent's head, and the serpent's seed would bruise the heel of the woman's seed. We probably could not understand this promise if we didn't know the rest of the Bible story. But God is saying that through the Eve's descendants, a Redeemer would come to deliver the world from Satan's power. The curse was that the woman's sorrow would be greatly multiplied both in the world and conception and in bringing forth children, and her desire would be to her husband, and he would rule over her. The man was also cursed, according to Genesis 3:17 and 18, by the ground being cursed to grow thorns and thistles, and man in this environment grow herbs for bread in sorrow and toil. As they leave the garden, we become aware of another tree, the tree of life. The Lord God said, "Behold, the man is becoming as one of us, to know good and evil. And now, lest he put forth his hand and take also the tree of life, and eat, and live forever," God drove them out of the garden to till the ground. Man and woman in their new environment was now subject to sorrow and agony caused by sin, and also became subject to death as well as all mankind. For this reason, we will later find that Adam is referred to as the father of sin. As we leave the garden story, remember the promise given to the woman about the serpent bruising the heel of the woman's seed, but the woman's seed bruising the head of the serpent. And we will later see its fulfillment. Referring to this chart that shows the approximate location of the Garden of Eden, we do know that the Tigris and Euphrates rivers are today found in the countries of Iraq and Iran. This region before the flood was probably very fertile. Outside the garden itself, God introduced the thorns, thistles, and other weeds that made farming the soil difficult for man. References in Genesis 2 verses 5 through 6 say that God has not caused it to rain upon the earth, but a mist came up from the earth and watered the entire face of the earth. We read about this condition existing until the time of the great flood, when waters came from above the earth as well as from its depths. Therefore, what once was probably a very fertile land is now a vast arid and desert land caused by differing conditions prevailing after the flood. Okay, let's review a little. God prepared a wonderful place for Adam and Eve to live, but their joy was not long-lived, because they were tempted by Satan, posing as a serpent, to eat the fruit of a forbidden tree that imparted to them the knowledge of good and evil. Since they were now aware of good and evil, or sin, God would not allow them to enjoy the benefits of the garden. For this, they were cast from the garden. Not only were they cast into a much more difficult environment to live in, but they were also subject to death, so as not to live forever as God does. This event tells us something of God's and man's nature. Eating of the fruit was wrong to God because it was not in obedience to his wishes or commands. God always has in mind the best for his creation, and when he asks us to do something, it is for our benefit. When we do not do as he's asked, punishment is forthcoming. So we will understand God means what he says and return to obediently follow him. Contrary to some public opinion today, many people feel that God only loves and does not bring his condemnation or wrath upon mankind. The creation story of the beginning does not support that conclusion. We'll have many opportunities to evidence God's nature as we go through this study. Regarding man and woman's nature, this story demonstrates that we can fall very quickly into temptation. Sometimes we can fall prey to very subtle invitations, and sometimes with open disregard for God's will or our own personal benefit. It is almost always what we really desire. Satan understands each of our natures and has the ability to influence our minds to do sinful and evil things we may think are not even possible to do. The Bible speaks of three influences on our nature: the lust of the eyes, the lust of the flesh, and the pride of life. Any sin can find its way into one of these influences. The consequence of Adam and Eve's sin was so far-reaching that it thrust all mankind into the same condition of having to deal with sin in our lives and having to experience death. We also leave a path of destruction when sin controls our life. However, God did not leave us alone to our own devices, but had a plan to provide a way for mankind to be obedient to His will. Remember the promise God regarding the serpents and the woman's seed in Genesis 3:14 and 15? The result would be for the betterment and restoring of man's relationship with God. It is evidence of God's love for us. Let's see what God had in mind for our benefit as the Bible story unfolds. This chart shows that after Adam and Eve are placed outside the garden, they begin having children. The first two children were Cain and Abel. The family began working the ground and raising sheep. Cain tilled the ground, and Abel was a keeper of sheep. Over time, Cain brought some fruit from the ground to offer to the Lord, and Abel brought of his firstborn of his flock and the fat from them, according to Genesis 4, verses 1 through 15. Abel's offering was acceptable to God, but Cain's was not. Apparently, God had instructed them about offerings to him. Cain became angry because Abel's offering was accepted by God, and in spite of God talking to Cain about his attitude, Cain killed Abel. For this sin, God punished Cain and made him a vagabond of the earth. Once the one sin was committed by Adam and Eve in the garden, it began to touch their sons and started spreading throughout the earth as the population grew. In Genesis 6 and verse 5, we are told that God saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. That's a very depressing thought, that the human race at that time thought only evil things continually. Adam and Eve's indiscretion had gone from a single sin to taking over and affecting every thought of an entire population of people. We can see the power of Satan in their lives. Consequently, God repented for having made man, grieved, and decided to destroy mankind and all that he gave life to on this earth. However, a man named Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord, according to Genesis 6 and verse 8. And we're told that Noah was a righteous man, walked with God, and God said to him, "The end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence through them. And behold, I will destroy them with the earth." Noah then is instructed by God to build an ark of gopher wood, possibly with rooms, and sealed with pitch inside and out. The length was to be 300 cubits long, or about 450 feet, 50 cubits wide, or about 75 feet, and 30 cubits high, or approximately 45 feet. We can stop and ask the question, would it have been right for Noah to make the ark 200 cubits long rather than 300 cubits long? The obvious answer is no, since that's not what God commanded. God told Noah that he was going to destroy everything by a flood, and then made a covenant with Noah that he and his wife and his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives, would come into the ark and be saved along with the pairs, both male and female, of all living flesh, fowl, cattle, and creeping things, and with food to sustain them. All souls to be saved from the flood were only 8. Genesis 6 and verse 22 says that Noah did this, he did all that God commanded him. From these events, we can see some of God's character. Disobedience is punished. For instance, Adam and Eve, Cain, those of the flood generation. But obedience is rewarded. All you have to do is look at Noah and his family. As a side observation, can you imagine what the people thought of Noah and his family while they were building the ark? Noah was given 7 days to load the ark with all the animals and fowl, along with the food necessary to sustain them. Of clean animals, a name used for those considered edible for human consumption, and fowl, 7 pair, male and female, were taken aboard the ark. The remaining unclean animals were taken in pairs, the male and his female. Then Noah and his wife and his 3 sons and their wives went aboard the ark. In Genesis 7 and verse 6 and verse 11, the Bible tells us that Noah was 600 years, 2 months, and 17 days old when the waters from within the earth and the rain from above came in abundance over the earth. The rain and waters lasted for 40 days and 40 nights. The ark was lifted by the waters and floated on the waters, while all within the ark were safe. The waters rose to more than 15 cubits, or about 22 feet, above the highest hills and mountain peaks. All living things perished on the earth: mankind, birds, domestic and wild animals, and reptiles. The waters covered the earth for 150 days. All the subterranean water from within the earth stopped gushing, and the torrential rains from above stopped. God caused a wind to come over the earth, and the waters started receding, and on the 17th day of the 7th month, the ark came to rest on Mount Ararat, according to Genesis 8. On the first day of the 10th month, the tops of the mountains could be seen, and after another 40 days and 3 weeks, using a dove to see if the earth was dry, Noah removed the covering of the ark and found the earth to be dry. This occurred on the first day of the first month of the 601st year of Noah. After 27 more days, in the 2nd month, God told Noah that he and his family and all in the ark could leave and breed and repopulate the earth. Noah and all that were with him on the ark were there for a little more than a year. There is a Mount Ararat in Turkey, and the Turkish people maintain to this day that this is the same mountain that the ark came to rest. Several efforts to reach the location have been attempted, but none have produced absolute evidence due to the severe weather conditions in the area and the difficult location of the large objects seen through glacial ice. If remnants of the ark were recovered, would it provide any more absolute evidence that God's Bible recordings of creation and flooding is true than evidences already accumulated in numerous geological findings that support a worldwide catastrophic flood having occurred? Archaeological findings dating back to 5000 BC in the Sumerian and Semitic peoples of Babylonia, known today as Iraq and Mesopotamia, find evidence of a flood in cuneiform writings and actual flood deposits, as well as scribes referring to the ages before the flood and after the flood. It's impossible to have a flood that covers more than 22 feet of the highest mountains in this region without covering all the lands of the earth. Also, numerous cities and civilizations have been uncovered that were spoken of in the Bible, but not known to man until having been excavated. One of the great discoveries was Ur of the Chaldees, where Abraham once lived. We will talk about him in our next chart of our survey. After Noah and all the creatures had departed from the ark, God made a covenant with Noah and his seed, his people, and every living thing with him, that he would no longer bring a flood over the entire earth. The token of this covenant is a rainbow in the sky for men and creatures to see, and also a reminder to God that this was his covenant with them. This has continued and will continue through the ages until the appointment of another time. It is also worth noting that this is the first time it had rained on the earth. Genesis 2 verses 5 to 6 says that God had not caused it to rain on the earth, but a mist had come up from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. This depicts an entirely different ecosystem before and after the flood. It's also possible that the rains and the flood came from the canopy of waters above the firmament, according to Genesis 1 and verse 7, which were separated from waters below the firmament. Firmament is defined as heaven in Genesis 1:8. People lived hundreds of years before the flood, and lifespans after the flood are more like that today. Temperatures also initially seem to be very mild and moderate over the face of the earth. North Arctic explorations for oil in this last century have produced findings that an event occurred which resulted in almost immediate freezing of animals and landscape, with animals frozen, chewing fresh vegetation in death. Also, an abundance of tropical vegetation was found in these same areas. This chart is a closer picture of Mount Ararat with its known snow-covered peak, located on the eastern side of the nation of Turkey. Mount Ararat is an inactive volcano, and it rises to over 3 miles above sea level. This picture is a satellite view. Near the peak of this mountain is the snow-covered area, and where the ark is thought to rest and is endorsed by all explorers as approximately the original settling place. Shifting from the original resting place may have occurred over time, since the steep, rocky, and snow-ice terrain could easily allow for some shifting even though the ark is very large. From the location of the ark within the glacial ice, it appears one end has settled somewhat lower than the other end. It's possible that with the tremendous amount of wet soil on the mountain, a shift could have easily occurred before freezing of the glacial ice. If the ark did rest on such a sloppy surface, Noah, his sons, and animals required much more effort than if on more level surface when leaving the ark. We previously said that the Bible answers three questions, the first being, where did we come from? Since Noah and his family were responsible for replenishing the earth, we all came from one of these three sons, Ham, Shem, or Japheth. Genesis 10 gives an account of the generations of the three sons and the areas each son went to enlarge their families. Japheth, in Genesis 10 verses 2 through 5, is said to be the father of the Gentile nations, or the Caucasian races. Most of us in America are Japhethites. Ham, which begins in Genesis 10 and verse 6, is cited as the father of Cush, which is Ethiopia, and Mitzrayim, which is translated into English as Egypt. Therefore, Ham was the father of dark-skinned peoples of the African continent. Shem, beginning in Genesis 10 and verse 21 and continuing through the 11th chapter in verse 26, is the father of Abram, later renamed by God as Abraham. Shem, then, is the father of the Jews and other Semitic peoples. With this knowledge of the beginning generations, lineages, and locations of their lands after the flood, all people can be traced back to one of the three sons of Noah for ancestral heritage. Regarding languages, the beginning of Genesis 11 tells us the sons of Shem's descendants migrated eastward and settled in a plain near Babylon. The people talked about building a great city with a temple tower that would reach to the skies. This would be a proud eternal monument to themselves and identifying themselves as a people. When God came down to see the city and the tower they're building, he was alarmed at what they had accomplished and concerned at what they might do in the future. Therefore, God said, let's give them different languages so they would not understand each other's words. In that way, God scattered them all over the earth and ended the building of the city. And that is why the city was called Babel, meaning confusion, and how the Semitic peoples became widely scattered throughout the whole earth.